Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Surviving second day? A little post-lunch slumber going on? Well, fortunately, they've scheduled some of the more exciting sessions this afternoon. I'm a little bit biased, but I think this will be a good one. A relevant topic in any time, but certainly now. So we are about a year out from the 2020 elections here in the United States, but also I think has a lot of relevance globally, as we'll get into here. My name is Luke McNamara. I'm a principal analyst at Fireeye. Joining me today here in this panel talking about election security, I have Mr. Jeff Hale, the director of the Election Security Initiative. Mr. Hale is the director of ESI, Department of Homeland Security and led interagency body charged with coordinating federal support to the election infrastructure community. Mr. Hale is a certified information systems manager and experienced cyber operations planner, and has supported the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications since 2010. Also, we're pleased to have joining us today Mr. Brandon Clifton, Chief of Staff and Deputy Secretary of State for the state of Indiana. Mr. Clifton joined Indiana Secretary of State in November of 2014. As Deputy Secretary and Chief of Staff, Brandon is responsible for administering the duties and responsibilities of the 61st Indiana Secretary of State, Connie Lawson, and one of 5 constitutional office holders and the 3rd highest ranking official in state government. So in his role, Brandon serves as the senior advisor to the Indiana Secretary of State and is responsible for representing her in official capacities. And then last but certainly not least, our surprise attendee here today, Katelyn Bailey, senior analyst with Fireeye in the Strategic Intelligence and Government group. Katelyn is a senior analyst on that team, specifically working on the advanced intelligence access, supporting U.S. government customers, creating more sustainable, secure, resilient cyber and communications environments through information integration and exchange of Fireeye intelligence. Prior to Fireeye, Katelyn also worked as a senior analyst at MSISAC, Cyber Integration Center for the United States state and local entities, so a lot of relevant experience for what we're going to talk about today. So I talked briefly, I guess, a little bit about your backgrounds, but if we could, just to start this off, talk a little bit around what specifically is within your remit and responsibility when it comes to election security.
Indeed.
Brandon.
So as Chief of Staff for Secretary Lawson, and each state is unique in its election administration, I work with the Indiana Election Division co-directors, Republican and a Democrat, appointed by the governor, who are responsible for advising and supporting election officials throughout the state. Indiana is very much a ground-up state, and each county is responsible for procuring their own equipment and working through the access that we provide for purposes of statewide voter registration. So working in collaboration with the bipartisan team, and then also through that vein supporting our local election community.
As a senior analyst at Fireeye and on the Strategic Intelligence and Government team, I work with some of our government partners to fuse Fireeye intelligence with some of the information and intelligence that they have in their own holdings. They use Fireeye information in a lot of different ways, sometimes to produce intelligence products that are enhanced with Fireeye telemetry, but also to lead hunt missions on election-related organizations, as well as sometimes to help in aiding in declassifying and lowering the classification level of the information so that the government can then share it with state and local who sometimes might not be cleared and might not be able to get that context.
We'll get into that definitely as we go into it in terms of cooperation and information sharing between all the different entities here that have a role. Yeah. And Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me. My organization focuses on providing election stakeholders with the information necessary to manage risks to their systems. We view that that includes election officials, vendors, the vendor community, campaigns, partisan organizations, and the whole election ecosystem writ large. We do that by both aggregating the intelligence that firms and the IC can provide, but also the findings that come from the assessments that we provide out in the field.
Gotcha. So we're here at a security conference talking about election security, but I think really before we can even get into that, we have to talk about, well, what is the threat? What is the threat landscape around that? There's certainly been a lot more written and discussed around threats to elections. But I think unfortunately a lot of these different terms have been muddled. I think we've sometimes confused the different types of threat activity we see and even the intent and purpose of that. So maybe Jeff and Katelyn, can you talk a little bit about what do we currently see, not just what we've seen historically here, but maybe what we're continuing to see abroad in terms of different threats. And what does that look like, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, it should surprise no one that's sitting in this room that we view the 2020 election as a target for likely adversary activity. But if we take those three buckets of what we see on election infrastructure, what we see against campaigns and partisan organizations, and what we see against the public, the threats are vastly different. With election infrastructure, we're seeing a lot of common network threats of commoditized malware, phishing attacks, the things you'd see on any network system. Certainly the integrity of these is essential, and so we put a lot of effort into assuring the ability to detect and prevent any type of attack against these systems. Campaigns and partisan organizations we've found to be less infrastructure dependent, more pop-up in nature. So a lot of the security practices that are relevant to them are oriented around securing better password management, securing their social media accounts, and a lot of the steps that you could take to prevent hack and leak. And then there's an ongoing pervasive attack or pervasive information operation against the electorate, it's kind of designed to sow division across the American public.
Yeah, thanks. Jeff, he covered a lot of it, but I guess sort of to reiterate, so Fireeye, we categorize the different types of election interference threats into 4 buckets. The first is that social media-enabled disinformation campaigns that he mentioned. And that's the kind of stuff that we see the Internet Research Agency out of Russia doing, some suspected Iranian-backed campaigns on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. The second category is the espionage type activity. This is sort of the traditional conduct a phishing campaign, drop a malware tool or something, and these don't always constitute election interference, but it can be a precursor to that. And then the third is that hack and leak that he mentioned briefly, and that's the break into a network, exfiltrate data, and then leak that in the attempt to sway public opinion. So kind of a combination of the first two, the social media campaign and the espionage campaign. And then the last is the targeting of the core elections infrastructure. When you have reached the election management systems or the electronic poll books, where the actor is at the level and point where they can alter votes or voters in the system.
Yeah. And Brandon, for you, in terms of looking at how you take this threat intelligence and this understanding of what we've seen previously, you know, there's a lot now that's been out there around groups like APD28 and Sandworm Team, and even some of the activity that we've seen from the Iranian groups you mentioned doing disinformation, what we see China doing in elections. To what extent do you find that as someone that's kind of working with organizations trying to provide security, do you find that actor-specific TTPs and information to be useful versus just focusing on the different threat vectors, focusing on the systems? How do you kind of balance those two, or how do you conceptualize or think about that stuff?
Yeah, we've come a long way since 2016. I mean, actionable intelligence is really the evolution of elections being designated as critical infrastructure. So, of course, we need to know the IP addresses that are hitting us, the suspected fake news, the suspected fake Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts, in an effort to disseminate that information for the use by the counties to block those IP addresses, or for just purposes of situational awareness. You know, just understanding what is happening around you in an effort to raise awareness for what may be coming in the future in terms of a phishing campaign or what the vector may be. So we need to know, and we do know, and we do have information now and packaged in timely ways to be very specific in our responses at the state level, and also provide that information to the counties. But also want the high level view of what the space is experiencing, what the international space is experiencing, which may ultimately end up being an election interference attempt, be it for purposes on our networks or from an informational-based perspective. So I think we got to have specific information, but we also want the larger landscape of what's happening in the field.
Yeah. Well, and that's a perfect segue, and I'm going to kick it right back to you on, you know, and I won't ask for you to put a specific scorecard on this, but how are we doing around election security when with the organizations that you work with, because I know you're involved and talk to a lot of the other states as well. You know, Katelyn, I know because we're a global company, we're working with other countries and outside entities.
Yeah.
And Jeff, kind of what you're seeing, how are we doing around election security?
I think we're doing a fantastic job. I think where we've come from since 2015 and 16 to where we are today is it's a completely different space. And heading into 2020, the country is in a much better position than when it was in 2015. I think maybe Chris had said this in his remarks as the keynote speaker. I mean, it was a real wake-up call for this community, for local administrators, for state administrators, for those responsible for standing up our networks with state governments, and thinking about the effort that is involved from the international threat perspective and the formative, losing my term here, the resources, I guess you should say, that's available with an international threat. Working together means that we can better combat that threat, but I think that we have a long way to go, and I don't think it's a long way to go is maybe the right term. We have a lot of opportunity in front of us to become more resilient as a country when it comes to protecting elections. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. We've come a long way. Just even to like having teams that didn't previously exist, like before the 2016 election, specifically at Fireeye and Fireeye Intel. But we're constantly looking at our adversaries, what are they doing, so that we can be knowledgeable about their capability, but also be able to assess the intent. And looking at global elections is a great example of that. And I think when we think about the threat to elections, and when we're thinking about actor sets, our mind might go to Russia first, and rightfully so. But there are also a lot of other actors that have shown interest previously in targeting the U.S. that are also actively involved in election interference globally. China is a great example. Just within the past year, we've reported on multiple different elections, mostly regionally. We assess that China's largely, at least with their election interference, driven by the Belt and Road Initiative, along with just maintaining some of that regional hegemony in that area. But knowing that capability exists, you know, we saw in July of 2018, they targeted the Cambodian elections, and were on multiple election-related organization networks there. And knowing that the capability exists, the tools exist, is so important. And whether or not the intent is there, obviously it has to be exercised, but keeping our eye on all the different actor sets is something that Fireeye is constantly doing. And I think that the focus and heightened focus on elections is leaps and bounds beyond what it was in 2016.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff, I might change this question slightly for you. So I'm going to give you a harder version of this.
It's great.
And you can definitely talk to what we're doing that's right, but particularly from what you see, where are some of those areas where we need to improve or do better on, or even maybe our kind of blind spots for maybe assessing our understanding of how well those areas are protected within the election ecosystem?
Okay.
He's mad.
No.
So I'll preface this that information sharing is not the be-all, end-all of security. We all know that in this room. But it is a component that can really improve the resilience across a subsector like this. And I'd say that the information sharing environment in this space is both the area of most growth and the area of concern. We've had a phenomenal success rate reaching the state level, reaching the large counties. We've gone from a space where states are accusing the Department of Homeland Security of hacking them to states actively putting DHS-funded intrusion detection sensors on their networks for the protection of of election infrastructure. That transformation's been phenomenal, but we still have a lot to do. We have an ISAC community that has more than 2,100 local jurisdictions, but that's of 8,800. So our ability to reach the states and the largest counties has been significant, but those small to mids are the growth area where we're really prioritizing. That's where I see a blind spot and a real concern.
Okay. And is this something, and Brandon, feel free to jump in here too, but is this something where some of the impediments are funding issues? Is it organizational? I mean, you have a lot of decentralization, which you can view as both a strength and also a weakness in trying to provide security to this ecosystem. Maturity, having the right people and capabilities there. What do you kind of see once you start drilling down to those levels that could be impediments to some of these, to rolling out the right level of security or having the systems protected?
I mean, it's a cop-out to say all of the above,
I know.
but certainly the resource constraints are probably the primary issue, and it's this inconsistent resourcing that doesn't allow for the retention of long-term cyber talent to help secure these systems. There are tranches of election funding that have been used well, but election officials have to be good managers of that money, and if they know it's coming at an inconsistent rate, they're planning over these 5-year spends. What we saw with the last HAVA funding, Help America Vote Act funding, the $380 million in 2018, is that the vast majority went to cybersecurity, the implementation of new voting systems, new voter registration systems, or enhancing their ability to audit. All fantastic cybersecurity practices for this sector. But that's 5-year money, and they should be afforded the ability to spend it over 5 years to retain the talent, not just to secure 2020, but there's elections to come beyond that. That resource constraint is probably the #1 issue, and the ability to get the right people to put hands on keyboards at each county level.
May I supplement?
Yes.
So, exactly right. You know, the money is provided for 5 years, but as we were discussing earlier, doesn't necessarily match with the potential criticisms that a state could receive if they don't use those funds immediately before 2020. So, and there's a disconnect there. So there's a lot of pressure that's felt in the community to use these one-time resources, one-time pots of money to respond to the immediate threat, as opposed to a longer-term approach over the course of the 5 years, and if not longer. So funding is critical, and long-term funding, long-term anticipated planned funding that we can make some long-term and informed decisions around is, I think, the big void that we have. And make no mistake, I mean, in Indiana, our ruralist counties, our most remote counties, I mean, these are my friends, these are my family, these are the people that I care about, and the same is true for each of the communities that you come from. But for every county, there is a different level of information technology resource, experience, security experience, and it doesn't match. We don't have the funding necessary to provide to the counties over a long-term basis to provide those resources, to install the Albert sensors, to make available other cybersecurity monitors and sensors. There is a vast degree of variance in between the type of resources and the experience and the staff that's available, if at all, to our counties.
And in some of your conversations with other states, you know, talking about that variance, what is that looking like? Because that funding can go to a lot of different things. It can go to things that are very much, you know, security focused. It can also go to just upgrading the technology and systems being used for voting, or going back to paper, which you could view as an upgrade or downgrade, I guess, depending on how you view it. But where do you see that funding going, and what are the frameworks by which different states are thinking about having to spend that?
Well, I think, you know, I heard a former senator and Indiana Senator and Director Dan Coates speak at a luncheon a couple weeks ago, and he spoke about what he saw during his time as director, and the private community, the private sector, far outpaces, of course, the government's ability to respond to an ever-changing threat and opportunities and tools and resources that are available to you and those that you're attempting to defeat. So unless funding is available to respond to changes in what the needs are at the network level, at the infrastructure level, at the staffing level, at the expertise level, we're always going to be limited to an extent based on what we could do at the time that funding was available. Whereas if we had long-term funding streams that we could depend on, I think we would have and would most assuredly have better capabilities to respond to a changing dynamic in the space.
Yeah. Jeff?
So in this sector, there's a pseudo-governance body called the Government Coordinating Council, and they advise on some security practices. And one of the things that they've kind of found a lot of value in across polling the states is a cyber navigator type program, and the ability for states to get and share expertise among counties. And so several states have implemented something like this. Others, if more funding comes, this can help because you do deal with election officials who are not digitally native, who wouldn't know how to determine their particular vulnerability posture. But getting that type of assistance down to the mids and small levels is essential.
Digitally native. I'm going to use that. That's great. I like that term.
So switching gears a little bit, and actually kind of returning to a topic we touched on at the beginning, disinformation, right? So we've talked a lot about kind of securing the actual systems themselves and you know, where the funding is kind of headed, kind of things within the network. Looking at threats outside the network, and I think this is an even greater kind of ask and leap for a lot of organizations to think about when all they're trying to do is just secure you know, the systems, the election systems, even some of the systems used for administering the systems. And now they have to think about this. They've got to think about disinformation. They have to think about how do I help empower maybe my community with tools to go and ascertain if what I'm looking at is the work of the Internet Research Agency or some of the Iranian activity we've seen. How do you guys think about that? How should organizations think about it? Because I think it is a very difficult problem, and it's written about a lot in the news, but I think there's a lot of questions, all right, well, what do I do with this information?
So if I may, Luke, I've thought a lot about this. I mean, you know, 50 years ago, wars were fought with tangible ammunition, and today wars are fought with bits and bytes. And how do you combat the war of an idea? I mean, it's even more intangible and invisible than what the fight is in the cyberspace. And it can be overwhelming to try to think about how to combat that, especially when a nation state has an active mission to sow disinformation in our democracy. And I think looking back in 2016, you know, that was an objective to let's cause chaos in the minds of Americans in an effort to drive us further apart than we've ever been before. And it certainly feels like today we're farther apart than we've ever been before. Across the aisle, so to speak. So what we do in Indiana is we have started you know, an earned media campaign, and we're going to be aggressive this fall to tell Hoosiers why they should feel confident in their elections. Tell the story again, because it's going to be eroded in 2020. And then during that time, we're going to combat the same message of why you should feel confident, what your elected officials who are accountable for protecting your elections, what they're doing. Wake up every day. That's the good cause that we have. And then after an election, what we started in 2018, we're fortunate enough to have a legislature that provides voter outreach funding, which we use for voter registration, reminders, and things like that, digital ads, TV ads. And what we're going to do is, and we started this in 2018, extending our public message on radio, on TV, and digitally after the election as to why Hoosiers should feel confident in their election. Something we haven't done before, but we felt the need to continue that message beyond an election because that's probably one of the more vulnerable times in confidence.
Yeah, I think that's really great. At Fireeye, the way we define sort of the disinformation campaigns is it has to be coordinated, political in nature, and also emanating from accounts that are false personas. They're not who they say they are. If they do say they are, you know, the Iranian government, then it's just essentially propaganda. So, you know, to what Brendan just said, it is something that's happened throughout all of history, we've seen these type of campaigns, but now it's in everybody's pockets, in their hands. And we're seeing, what scares me with the information disinformation is the distrust sort of that has just been sown in the American people and there sounds like they're doing a great job in Indiana to address that. And some of these I.O. campaigns that are ongoing, we've seen a lot, and actually Atlanta Council just published a great report back in July on creating and fabricating these documents that seem legitimate, and then they dubbed it, it's called Operation Secondary Infection, and it's named after Operation Infection, which was the Soviet-era campaign that spread the story that the US had created the AIDS virus. And it's planting this story in a distant media outlet and then getting it to eventually funnel through other organic channels and eventually getting picked up by legitimate news outlets and then accepted as fact. And we're seeing what's suspected to be Russian actors doing that currently. And what's alarming to me is that it sort of muddies the water between what is a traditional disinformation campaign and then a hack and leak. And it gets to the point now where the American people will look at something, and it may be completely fabricated, but we know that this has also happened, where they legitimately exfiltrate data and leak legitimate documents or emails. And it gets to the point where they read something and sort of, I just imagine throwing your hands up, and the distrust is so strong, I feel like, in some cases. And that's what's alarming, because if they decide not to go to the polls, then the actor has succeeded and accomplished their task, because the less people that go and vote, the less people that those actors have to influence to achieve their end. I just rambled, sorry.
I think if you look at 2016 as a playbook, you can see that the information operations activity can be both chronic and acute. And I believe that it's that first set where you're getting this pervasive, divisive material that you're going to counter by building media literacy and resilience in the community to think before you link, to recognize the risk of disinformation. But it's also, there's a different approach when you get to that acute, patently false call to action that's go vote on Monday, go vote on Wednesday, things that you can counter. So for that acute operation, we're working with election officials or trusted sources of information to help direct the public to places, not DHS at all times, but who you can go to identify are you registered to vote, where your polling location is, and again, trusted sources of information for those communities to counter those acute messages.
So let's stay on this a little bit from the perspective of communication, because I like kind of what you brought in here about what you're doing in Indiana, especially post-election. But we were talking a little bit in the green room before about, I think, kind of rising concerns around how ransomware could be utilized. Or even, let's just say, I mean, it's pretty rampant right now, hitting a lot of states and municipalities. Let's say a city, a county gets hit with ransomware in the process of an election. What does the messaging need to look like in terms of, okay, if I'm just an average citizen, I see this in the news, I know something's happened, I know there's been some sort of hack, and this has happened around an election, how do I know that my vote is secure? How do you think about messaging what is often a very technical issue and a very technical problem, but also understanding that if it is something that's a much more concerted and directed threat actor sort of activity or campaign, the intent is to attack confidence in the process. So how do you take care of that? How do you address those sort of concerns in a way where you're having to communicate very technical information to a lay audience?
Well, I think your starting point is right. You have to attempt to articulate a very technical process to the extent that you can to a diverse community made up of experienced individuals and people who are not digitally native. I want to try to find a way to fit it in one more time. But at the same time, it's important to explain to the community the backups that we have in place, the paper-based backups that we have in place. Polls and precincts and vote centers should have paper backups of their voter registration lists, should have paper ballots available if electronic machines go down, or if there's a calibration issue and the machine has to be pulled, or all machines have to be pulled. in an effort to continue the process of voting, to capture the vote, because that's what we have to do. We have to capture it. So I think explaining the technical landscape, but then providing assurance that the insurance package is non-technical in nature, and we can go back to these paper-based solutions is an avenue that we're attempting to relay in Indiana. And then in addition, with regard to it, has my vote been counted, post-election audits are critical. And we're starting those this year, and we'll see a larger county population participate next year. But taking that sample of ballots, which is consistent with either past trends or similar races in other jurisdictions and other counties, provides complete assurance that the vote and the outcome of the election is as it should be. We could go back and do a complete recount. It's very expensive to do so, so in an effort to drive confidence up post-election, post-election audits are critical.
Brandon hit it exactly right. It's how do you arm the Secretary of State or the chief election official with the necessary information to convince or to explain to the American public that their vote was counted as cast and that's why the DHS has been a big proponent of auditability across this sector. It's just something that people understand, their ability to auditability and software independence. It will help to detect any type of manipulation and help to ensure that their vote is cast and counted as represented.
Yeah. So kind of zooming out of the communications piece a bit and talking about sort of coordination amongst all of our different orgs, private sector, or federal government, state and local government. Where are areas where that, and again, information sharing is not the end-all be-all, but where is that the most useful that you are seeing, either in sort of the run-up to the election or, certainly as we get closer, the sort of near-time or near real-time ability to share intelligence? Where do you find that to be most useful? Is it sharing best practices? Is it sharing tactical intelligence? Amongst the coordination of even a lot of other stakeholders that aren't represented here. We think about the intelligence community, Cyber Command, some of the tech platforms. Everyone kind of has a piece of it and a role in this. So how do you think about where communication is most useful across this entire ecosystem?
I think that shifts the closer we get to an election. Right now, it's in how to prepare, what to procure, what types of systems may be more secure or enable different security capabilities. Also, Katelyn actually briefed election officials on threats that are occurring in different countries and their elections there. That helps to keep a rich and robust threat picture across the election community and keep this at top of mind when making procurement decisions. But the closer we get to the election, it is about actionable intelligence and what's happening on other state networks and what might be actively threatening election infrastructure in this country.
Yeah, and I think the information sharing isn't end-all be-all, but it is crucial. And having the communication plan, and I know we're working on building those, or some probably already exist. But for Fireeye and all private sector vendor partners, we try to help bridge a gap with that information sharing on the pieces that maybe the federal government or the state and local agencies might not have access to. Fireeye, we have a global appliance network as well, and we have a close partnership with DHS where we can help look at some of those, the news organizations, the nonprofits, the political parties, the SLTT organizations, some of those that Jeff mentioned in the beginning, and try to share actionable intelligence, anonymized indicators that they can then use to action and share out to those the stakeholders who need to do something with it. Yeah.
Kind of forget the question, but I'll just piggyback off of what's already been said, and we'll see if it fits into the question that you asked. So I think the point is absolutely correct. There's a scale, an inverse correlation. The farther we are from an election, the more that we can ask for security preparation purposes from our local election administrators. We can work with them to develop incident response plans. We can work with DHS to gather best practices and build that into the operations of the local administration. But as we get closer, there's multiple hats. We've added the cybersecurity hat to election officials, which already had full-time jobs. And so as we get closer to an election, they're in election administration mode. And then it becomes, as the point's already been said, about actionable intelligence. We need to be efficient with their time. And at the same time, as local election time is taken up, the closer we get to an election, from Indiana's perspective and others, the state's time increases in bandwidth and availability to assist in the dissemination of information. So hopefully that fits.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
No, and also, I guess, kind of ask maybe somewhat the inverse, which is, from all the different stakeholders that are involved in this, what sort of categories of groups or organizations would you like to see maybe a little bit more involvement or investment in throughout the ecosystem that could help you guys do your jobs?
I don't want to put anybody on blast. I think.
Or where can we improve? Let's put it this way. Where can we kind of improve in that larger communications piece?
I think that some of the declassification of intelligence and then getting that to the actual people who need it. So the people that have the information, the federal government, they have a lot of the funding, the information, intelligence, but the fight is down at the state and local level, and that's where they need it. So, I'm always proud when we can get some of that information to the state and locals via the partnership with DHS to help, because intelligence can be used not only to spin up a cycle and say that this is a serious problem, this is an APT tool that may be trying to interfere, but it also can be used to spin down cycles and say, no, it's, for example, quickly tell a story. We, a couple years ago, had an incident at an election-related organization. There was an APT tool, and it remained on one system, and obviously a concern, election-related organization, APT malware. But then after doing some research, we were able to identify that organization had recently put out a request for resumes for native language speakers. And the actor set that we attributed that tool to was known to do counter-intel, monitor dissidents. And so using that intelligence at a declassified level, unclassified, I should say, not declassified, we were able to spin down the cycles and say, even though it's APT, your election-related organization, it's not election interference incident. And that's very important. And I think being able to partner further with government to government to SLTT, and private sector to all of the above can help improve.
I mean, the behemoth that is the federal government isn't always oriented around being rapid. So in that sense, a lot of the cyber threat firms have been willing to come to the table and give briefings to election officials and really demonstrate what the threat vector that they see. And we've gotten really positive feedback from those engagements. And a lot of the election officials that we interact with say that they're getting a lot of value out of those conversations because it's direct and to the point, and they don't have to get into a skiff. And now it's not the government attributing a nation state doing this, but in terms of planning and preparing their systems, it's equally as important.
Well, so I'm about to open it up to questions here in a couple of minutes, so get some ideas ready of what you want to ask our panelists. But before that, just kind of one final question. We're here at a cybersecurity conference. You guys are all technologists and policymakers. We kind of view this problem through that lens in terms of helping provide security around that. But I think each of the different areas that you all sit in give you kind of a window in looking at the extent and limitations of technology, of policy to addressing this problem. So what do you think can we do to help secure elections, to help better instill people's confidence in the system that falls outside that category? Very, very open-ended meta question, but what can we do where maybe that last mile or other areas of improvement to further instill people's confidence in this process?
I'll go first.
Sweet.
So you guys won't take my
Yeah,
answers, maybe.
I'll
Beyond the policy, beyond I think what is the first thing that comes to my mind is that as a country, addressing this as an apolitical problem. So beyond the policy piece, I think education is what comes to mind first. Beyond just educating about the issue, but more collaboration between private sector. So collaboration with organizations like Fireeye, who have been able to identify information operation campaigns, know what constitutes that, and more collaboration with the social media companies where some of this activity is emanating out of, and establishing an education standard for how do we identify this, how do we detect this, and then coordinating with the government to then push that messaging and that education standard down. Additionally, collaborating with our foreign partners as well and helping them in this fight too, because the more cost burden we can put on the adversary, the more we disrupt them, hopefully we'll continue to discourage the activity.
Elections are run at a state and local level for a reason, and I think that reason is really to advance transparency in the system. So the main thing that I think that people can do is to engage in that process. You can view pre-election testing. In some states, you can view the vote tally or the post-election audit. And this level of transparency is the way to get your questions answered. And the one step beyond that is actually volunteering as a poll worker and getting involved in the process, because that's the way that you see what security measures are put in place, what physical procedures are put in place that actually secure your vote across the country.
Again, hopefully I'll just say some stuff and we'll see if it fits.
It's open-ended.
Great, thank you. Campaigns. I think campaigns are a piece we haven't talked about yet. And there's obviously a lot of turnover in campaigns, a lot of different campaigns that spin up in every election year. And so there's a great opportunity if campaigns, if we can standardize, and we've attempted to do some of this in Indiana by offering free online cybersecurity training to anyone, any campaign volunteer that wants to acquire that training. And I think there's a greater population amongst the campaigns and throughout this country than there are election officials as they're elected and staff come and go. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to boost confidence in the American community by way of the awareness, the situational awareness and the understanding of the vulnerabilities that are presented to each and every campaign if they don't take certain steps. So I think it's a huge opportunity to build momentum and education and awareness. Every campaign has family, has friends, has volunteers, and I think there's a huge opportunity for momentum with regard to awareness and social media awareness and good cyber hygiene practices that I think is the next phase, next opportunity we have available to us.
Yeah.
That's great.
So any questions out here? I know we have a microphone, I think, up over
We have a line already,
somewhere.
I think.
I can't see.
Right, she's
Over
right
there. Okay. We have a first question. I can see you there. Yes.
Yeah, so this, I guess, is primarily for the panelist from DHS. I think I understood there are 8,800 jurisdictions that are involved in the voting process, and that going back to paper is an option, like a plan B. And I was wondering if, and I imagine there's also, I mean, we've heard that resourcing and resources are an issue among these jurisdictions, and if there were a determination that some of these jurisdictions were really way behind the curve, that they were not going to be ready to go come election day to have a reliable voting count, is there any authority that the federal government has, or maybe this would also be for Indiana at the state level, are people, is there anything to do more than just compel people to have secure elections? Can they be required because they're part of our critical infrastructure, or are we just depending on people to, do their best and come what may?
So you referenced critical infrastructure. That's a voluntary partnership where it allows us to prioritize services out to the field. we do not have the authority to compel anything. State and locals run elections for a reason in this country, and we're going to adhere to that constitutional aspect of the job. But should any state ask for our assistance, we're going through hell or high water to help them.
So many things in my mind, 90% of which is probably inappropriate for this forum. So as a state election administrator, I trust the state. I know what the Indiana constituents will say. They trust Indiana and they trust their local election administrators. Also, we have earned, and through this partnership, a lot of trust with DHS and our federal partners. But when it comes to election administration, those responsibilities belong to local election administrators, and local accountability and transparency is what I think the framers of the Constitution had in mind when it came to capturing your vote for the future election, the future office holder.
I doubt they had election hacking in mind when they wrote those provisions, but
Indeed.
I'll turn it over to the next person.
So my question is about, since you've gone over all the processes involved in the elections, are you seeing anything in terms of the processes themselves from an information security perspective, not necessarily cyber perspective, but just in general? Are the processes solid, or have we not paid attention to them before, and now we're realizing that regardless of the technology, there may be an issue? And as an example of it, just like a small part, it's like, for example, if we need to go to paper, are we really sure that we can somehow assure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information on paper?
I have some points I'd like to make about paper, but I think there were probably more substantive.
So we have viewed risk to the administration of election down to the component level, and there are, by and large, there are physical countermeasures or compensating controls for a lot of the risks, the information security risks of the process. There are some areas that are non-standard. Third-party ballot programmers is an area where we look to elevate the security posture across the community. But this is a thing that we're working with, I referenced the Government Coordinating Council before, and working across the election security community to push out those practices.
There are some complex points here, and I've spoke a little bit about paper and electronic. Indiana has both types. Half of our counties vote on a direct record electronic machine where that electronic vote tabulator is capturing that vote. We're adding a voter verifiable paper trail to that equipment. But paper isn't without problems. Paper, we have absentee ballot fraud quite regularly throughout this country. I'm not aware of a single vote that's ever been changed by way of an electronic machine. I'm not aware of any intelligence that says that. So there's a blend there between the assets and the benefits of paper versus electronic machines. And I think that delicate balance is appropriate for state and local election administrators and what constituents want to see in their local elections. So perhaps maybe not right on point, but.
We have time, I think, for one more question.
Thank you, everyone. So I know since the 2016 election, there's been a growing kind of consensus talk about what the National Guard and Reserve can do to help out in elections, especially with the growth of cyber protection teams. So I'm kind of wondering at maybe a state level, I'm not sure if Indiana has any cyber protection teams in the National Guard right now, but also DHS, what they may be doing, if anything right now, to link up with states that do have cyber protection teams to kind of coordinate this on a local level.
We're working through some of that right now in incident response planning with Indiana University. The National Guard is obviously, as you're well aware, a tremendous resource, but there are some funding triggers that occur once the National Guard is activated. And what's that pot of money? What's that source? So just some careful consideration as to how and when they fit in, and what circumstances would arise to trigger that need.
Katelyn, Jeff?
Some states have highly capable National Guard units and are using them very effectively, either to aggregate intelligence and pass it down, or hands-on keyboards. That's not consistent across the country, but we do actually, as a whole federal government, we convene and share information and feed the beast to get as much out to the field as we can. So the states that have those capable National Guard units, we've really welcomed their assistance. They can scale at a rate that DHS doesn't, and it's been a phenomenal partnership.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for, I think it was a good conversation here on election security. And stay tuned for the next topic right after this. Thank you, guys. Thank you.